attempts at divagations and radicalizations of the going fair. Um, let's see if we can find an avenue of invasion into more radical, simple ground back behind all the talk of surplus, which uh, spills back and forth between the Marxist thought of the surplus value, which is to say people don't get their actual um, the compensation overall, not just in direct dollar value of their labor, in the sense that some raw material, timber, hule, remembering Aristotle has originally used the notion of material as not sorghum or just firewood lying around in the forest. So both the Latini and the Greeks made a distinction between just the firewood and wood that was sitting around, and timber, which could be usefully used to make something, hule, which we called material. And this notion of the surplus value is that you take the timber or the hule, but in its taken more generally, it could be rare earth materials from the Sudan or anything else that somebody has to put their labor into or their intellectual capacities to, and spend some time with, and then transform into a cell phone or into something which is no longer a raw material but a piece of equipment for human beings to use in the polis. And that this move from the raw material to the usable equipment is an expenditure of time, which Locke has theorized as labor. All value comes from labor, is the conclusion. It's the theoretical meaning of both capitalism and communism. The only difference between communism and the pure theoretical version says that there cannot be inheritance. Everyone always has to start from zero. Starting from this kind of theory and then saying, where does it happen that the surplus value is siphoned off and given over to the Warren Buffett or the Bill Gates or the Jamie Dimon? Where does it happen? Or let's say the oligarchs in the Ukraine, Poroshenko and so forth, the famous chocolate oligarch who put a swastika on his chocolate bars, and who embraced the autocephalous church of Ukraine and had them and aided them in breaking off and throwing up banners to flutter in the wind with the picture of Stepan Bandera on them, and naming streets after Stepan Bandera. The notion of the siphoning off of some of the value of the Narad or of the people to the wealthy is the notion of surplus in this sense, but that's not the complete notion of surplus. Then we see the problem is that you can never say how much is this man's time really worth. Say you have an artist who's striving incessantly towards some goal, and when he achieves it after a lifetime, nobody has any use for it. It's not, and then they say, well, he wasn't gifted after all, because to be gifted would mean to be able to produce something that the polis would consider a gift to them, that they would want and consider worth a while. So you can't just say that somebody putting their labor in is actually worth something, and then we can never figure out what the value is, and there's no practical way to handle it. But then, more simply, this idea of the surplus means that the original value, the supposed natural value, never existed. We just sort of thought it existed because during the medieval period, with the medieval corporations or guilds, there was such a steady state of the economic situation that it was taken as the normal values were only seldom disrupted in such a way that then one could speak of debasement of the coin, inflation, something going wrong with the system. The economics was not yet a science until the time of Hobbes. Hobbes created the first economist. His personal student, Petty, was a funny name, David Petty, was the first modern economist. And the reason that we say this is the first modern economist is because this was the first person who thought you needed a lot of theory and speculation to understand what was going on in an industrial economy. One aside I'll say here, in every question of ideas, we can always superimpose the question whether the idea leads or whether the change in the economic situation is determinate. But either way, if you have, so for instance, the revolutions in various agricultural revolutions, the overshot mill, technological changes in the kind of wagons people use, in the wheelbase of wagons and so on. All kinds of things of this kind, material changes in this sense, then attract different theorizations, different understandings of how we should different rationales of how we should best understand it, and then some click. So then the Lockean theory of capitalism has enjoyed a great power, great success in being our intellectual guide, just as in the 4th century or so, in the Middle Kingdom, the land we call today China, the Buddhist ideas imported from India became the intellectual power par excellence and displaced the Confucians for a time. And then later on, there was a return of the literati, and they displaced the Buddhist power. Likewise, we can see other regimes of current intellectual power in different circumstances. So there's always this question of what were the circumstances and why did the ideas fit them, and which leads the ideas or the circumstances. And this is especially the kind of question that was being fought out when we get into these questions of the so-called transcendentalists as against the so-called transcendentalism as against predictedism, or what I want to say is the theory of predication. And so that's, for instance, in Hegel, that's the whole orientation is on the one side you have the transcendental, which amounts to the ontological, and then on the other side you have the predicatory, which amounts to speculative reason. And of course Hegel famously says you have to write down time. In other words, you have to predicate. That's an example of what predicating means. You have to write, this is 10:30 on a certain afternoon, oriented towards the notion of the common era, which begins with the radical event of the birth of Christ. Or if we were in the Muslim world, then our calendar would be different, right? The place that we would predicate the beginning of time would be different. So here we have this notion of this surplus value, and then we get the notion of surplus, which proves to be always surplus. So again, it turns out that value as such never has a natural value, but it only seemed to because there are long periods of stability. And then we find out that the same thing is true with pleasure. So we get so here we get incursions into something along the line of the original understanding of the Keynes story, and and the notion of the original sin and things like this, there's some break for which we then call it the surplus. Cain says, is asked, where is your brother? And he replies, I don't know. He replies, I didn't know. So in the text, the normal interpretation, which we got from antiquity, or not from around the time of Christ, the interpretation we got from around the time of Christ is still in power, of course, in that, where Cain is pictured as sardonic, saying, like, I don't know, you tell me, or whatever. But in the text, when we look at the original text, we can see that what he's really saying is, I didn't know. Is Abel my brother? Am I my brother's keeper? So what he's really saying is, I've awoken to the fact that out of the fog of animality, I've awoken to the notion that I have a brother. And then later this is developed, of course, in the Christian teaching. All men are a part of the brotherhood of men. This kind of surplus, I think we could see in a simple example, which is stronger than either the notions of that Zizek is usually using in the split between nomos and physis, which is at the beginning of the tradition. But even prior to the beginning of the tradition, we have in the education of Cyrus in the Persian world, but given by a Greek, the notion that, or the anecdote, or historical anecdote, that when Cyrus was very young, he was taught by his Persian masters that you don't, if you have a jacket, say you have a jacket that would fit a fat person, and you have another one that's fit a slim person, you don't give it according to their needs. You give it rather according to whether they own it or not. You take into account the nomos or the convention situation, and you let that govern. You give things to people according to whether they own it or not according to whether it's fitting or not. This is the thing that not Marx, but later on communism, as distinguished from socialism, attempts to cure. So socialism is the idea of curing the surplus value issue, so everybody gets their due pay. Communism is the idea that everybody gets what they need, so that the fat person gets the jacket that fits the fat person, the slim person the jacket that fits the slim person, and that we disregard the money situation. This is where we could see a lot of empirical historical examples about this question playing out in the Soviet Union of the move from socialism to communism. This as a basic, I think, then we could see as pitting Hayek and the claim that all freedom comes through the convention or nomos of the money relations, as against this Zizekian dread of the nomos surplus. Why does Zizek dread the nomos surplus? I think it's because Zizek is constantly under the pretense that one can remove the nomos and then go just to physis. And he keeps pretending that this is not a surplus situation, which is, say, the surplus situation again is the situation where you find out that value was never what you thought it was. It was always a surplus. There's no situation where there's not the surplus. So there's some kind of obfuscation fog that hasn't lifted in this thinking.